Jamie Raskin just asked the question Republicans can't answer, and it cuts deeper than any political talking point. In a congressional hearing meant to highlight progress for trafficking survivors, Raskin ripped the mask off Washington's hypocrisy with one devastating question: who are they protecting? It wasn't theater, it wasn't empty rhetoric. It was a challenge that forced the room and the country to look at what's really being hidden behind closed doors. Because if lawmakers can pass bills claiming to support survivors while ignoring the voices of those demanding the release of the Epstein files, then what does justice really mean? Raskin wasn't just talking about Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell. He was talking about the system that shielded them, the banks that moved their money, the agencies that looked away, the political figures who stayed silent.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the distinguished gentleman for his statement. I'm pleased we're marking up the Bipartisan Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, a bill which is going to provide relief to victims and survivors of human trafficking who themselves have been unjustly targeted and criminalized as a result of their involvement in trafficking as victims. We've been pushing for nearly a decade to make this relief available at the federal level. And I'm delighted that we're able to work together on a bipartisan basis, and I look forward to its swift passage. But America, Mr. Chairman, is going to be wondering how we can pass a bill today called the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act when we turn a blind eye and a cold shoulder to the trafficking survivors who came to Washington, D.C. last week to demand the complete, comprehensive release of the Epstein files. It's not going to make any sense to America. In fact, it's going to look like we're trying to cover up for the cover-up that's taking place of the Epstein files. You know, the administration moved unilaterally to get Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirator, partner in sex crime, moved from her prison in Florida to a minimum security prison nicknamed Club Fed in Texas. This shocked the Epstein survivors who came to Washington last week and said this blatantly preferential treatment of Maxwell, which may border on witness tampering, was, quote, the justice system failing victims right before our eyes. But this isn't just about Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell. I mean, who's being protected by the members of Congress who refuse to sign on to the discharge petition? By the way, we have a new member of Congress today from Virginia who has just come to join us. And he's adding his name to the discharge petition. That means any one of my colleagues on the Republican side can be the deciding signature on the discharge petition. You can take a stand and be a profile on courage, at least in standing up against Donald Trump. It's not really a profile on political courage because the vast majority of the American people want to see it. But I guess these days standing up against Donald Trump is what qualifies as political courage in Lincoln's party. But look who's being protected if you don't sign it. Well, all of those who abused children right alongside Jeffrey Epstein. All of his unnamed, unidentified co-conspirators who were protected by Alex Acosta's original corrupt bargain immunity agreement. All those people are being protected by your silence, your passivity. All of the banks, like Deutsche Bank, which allowed, facilitated, and failed to report the transactions that allowed this massive child trafficking ring to proceed. Millions and millions of dollars moving around the country to give to the girls, to cover it up, to pay people off. And then the modeling agencies that were used as a big cover story to traffic and abuse these children. That's who's being protected by your complicity with this new plot after Donald Trump performed a U-turn and decided, no, he didn't want the Epstein files out anymore. But that's not all, because this administration has been systematically dismantling 25 years worth of bipartisan progress made in combating trafficking and in protecting the victims and survivors, all while claiming they're making America safe again. But they're starving the offices and programs of funding and of staffing, and they've made it much harder to prosecute child traffickers and sex offenders. In February, the DOJ's Office on Violence Against Women removed all information on funding opportunities against human trafficking from the website. In April, the DOJ's Office of Justice Programs terminated hundreds of grants awarded to state and local law enforcement, defunding the police, and nonprofit groups that help survivors of sexual and domestic violence. Take the Hope and Healing Survivor Resource Center, based in the chairman's beautiful home state of Ohio. Hope and Healing provides emergency shelter, crisis services, and support to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, including women like Casey, a stay-at-home mom who found a loaded pistol and 2 shotguns hidden in her house just days after her husband sexually assaulted her. Hope and Healing was able to get Casey and her kids out of the house and helped her to land on her feet. Federal grants make up 75% of that group's budget. Losing that funding would force Hope and Healing to fire their staff, including court advocates who help survivors navigate the legal system. This is going on throughout the federal government. They are gutting the anti-human trafficking programs. So leaving aside all of the political finger-pointing back and forth and who got there first to denounce child sex trafficking and so on, let's leave that to the side. Why don't we get together and say that we are going to work together to restore all of the funding and all the programs that have been gutted by the Trump administration so far. And we'll have more to say about exactly how that's happening. I'm glad to see Congress is going to act to support victims and survivors in this bill. I urge my colleagues to support it, but I would also encourage all of our colleagues across the aisle to join committee Democrats to ensure that the federal government is doing whatever it can to empower the survivors and the victims of sex trafficking. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back without objection. All other opening statements will be included in the record. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a
Without
substitute.
objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered base text.
For decades, Epstein operated in plain sight. And the truth is, he got away with it not because no one knew, but because too many chose not to act. The hearing began with lawmakers celebrating the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, a bill designed to clear the records of individuals who were criminalized despite being victims themselves. On paper, it sounded like a victory, finally giving survivors a chance to rebuild without the weight of unjust charges dragging them down. Jamie Raskin acknowledged the importance of this progress but didn't let the moment pass without pointing out the glaring contradiction. How, he asked, can Congress pat itself on the back for helping survivors today while ignoring the survivors who traveled to Washington just last week begging for the release of the Epstein files? Those victims weren't looking for favors or sympathy. They wanted the truth, the full record of who enabled Epstein and how he managed to evade accountability for decades. Raskin's warning was clear to the American people: this double standard doesn't look like compassion, it looks like cover-up. Passing one bill while burying the files sends a dangerous message that justice is conditional and transparency negotiable. And for survivors who risked everything to confront power, that contradiction is more than political, it's personal. For many survivors, the most painful moment wasn't what Congress said but what the justice system did. When Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's longtime accomplice, was quietly transferred from a secure facility in Florida to a more relaxed minimum security prison in Texas, outrage erupted. Survivors called it a betrayal, describing the move as justice failing right before our eyes. To them, it looked less like a routine transfer and more like preferential treatment for someone who had played a central role in their suffering. Some even warned it bordered on witness tampering, a signal that powerful figures were still being shielded. After years of silence and denial, victims who bravely spoke out expected accountability, not leniency. The decision reinforced their belief that the system bends for the well-connected while leaving the powerless behind. And it wasn't only about Maxwell, it was about what her treatment revealed. If she could be granted comfort despite the severity of her crimes, then what chance did ordinary survivors have of ever seeing true justice? This shocking decision left many asking if accountability isn't being pursued at the highest levels, who is the justice system really protecting? Jamie Raskin's central question landed like a hammer: who is being protected? Because by refusing to release the Epstein files, lawmakers aren't just blocking documents, they're shielding names, institutions, and entire networks. Survivors have long suspected that Epstein's operation thrived not in isolation, but through a web of enablers who were never exposed. The original immunity deal struck years ago protected unidentified co-conspirators, giving them cover to escape scrutiny. Banks like Deutsche Bank, which facilitated suspicious transactions without raising alarms, became silent partners in the exploitation. Modeling agencies, used as fronts to recruit and traffic young girls, offered Epstein legitimacy while hiding darker realities. Every delay in releasing the files keeps these entities safe from public accountability. Raskin's warning was blunt: congressional silence doesn't just protect reputations, it protects abusers. Survivors and the public are left to wonder how many powerful figures still remain untouchable, shielded not by evidence of innocence but by deliberate secrecy. And that secrecy doesn't just erase history, it ensures exploitation thrives again. Which forces the question: if the victims are not the ones being protected, then who benefits from keeping these files in the dark? At one point, the demand for Epstein file transparency was bipartisan. Lawmakers on both sides spoke about accountability, insisting the public had a right to know who was involved and how such a system operated in plain sight. But then something shifted. The urgency faded. Some of the loudest voices calling for action suddenly grew quiet, while others began offering excuses for delay. What once was a principle, full transparency for the sake of survivors, became a political bargaining chip. To survivors it felt like betrayal. To the public it looked like cowardice. Raskin called it out directly: refusing to move forward doesn't make you neutral, it makes you complicit. Protecting reputations in the halls of power cannot outweigh the cries for justice from those who endured the abuse. And yet the reversal exposed a painful reality about Washington: courage is rare when accountability comes too close to home. The Epstein case stopped being about justice and started being about self-preservation. And while lawmakers hesitated, the files stayed sealed, the survivors waited, and the same question echoed louder than ever: if transparency was once promised, why is it now being buried? While politicians argued in Washington, survivors were the ones paying the price. Over the last several years, critical funding streams meant to support trafficking victims have been quietly dismantled. Grants that once kept shelters open, funded legal advocates, and provided crisis intervention have been cut or allowed to expire. For survivors, these programs weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. Take the Hope and Healing Resource Center in Ohio, which relies on federal grants for nearly 3/4 of its budget. Without that support, shelters risk shutting their doors, advocates lose their jobs, and families fleeing violence are left without options. Survivors who already face enormous barriers to rebuilding their lives are suddenly abandoned, forced to navigate danger and trauma with less protection than ever. Raskin pointed to this erosion of support as proof of a deeper hypocrisy. Lawmakers praise survivors in public yet strip away the very resources those survivors need to survive in private. To the victims who traveled to Washington, this contradiction is unbearable. They don't just see a system that failed once, they see a system that continues to fail, again and again. And each cut, each delay, sends the same chilling message: survival isn't the priority, silence is. The Epstein story has always been bigger than one man. Jamie Raskin made that clear when he reminded the room that Epstein was only the face of a much larger system. Behind him stood an entire network of enablers, banks that moved his money, institutions that ignored red flags, and agencies that looked the other way. Modeling agencies provided a front, financial institutions processed suspicious transactions, and powerful figures were given immunity through legal loopholes. This wasn't just a series of mistakes, it was an infrastructure of exploitation, built on silence and protected by influence. That's why the demand to release the files carries so much weight. It's not simply about uncovering names, it's about exposing how deeply power was intertwined with abuse. If those files remain sealed, then the very structures that allowed Epstein to thrive remain intact, ready to protect the next predator with enough money and connections. For survivors, this isn't abstract, it's their lived reality. Every day the truth stays hidden is another day the system proves it values secrecy over justice. And that is the bigger picture. Without full transparency, the cycle doesn't end, it resets. At the center of all the hearings, petitions and political debates are the survivors. For them this fight isn't about partisanship, it's about reclaiming their voices. Many endured years of abuse while institutions stood by, and now they're forced to watch as politicians delay, deflect, and protect the powerful. Survivors describe it as being silenced twice, first by their abusers, and now by the very government that claims to defend them. Each time the Epstein files are kept hidden, survivors lose another chance at closure, another chance to see accountability. The toll is more than symbolic, it's deeply personal. Some survivors have said that watching Maxwell's treatment, or seeing shelters stripped of funding, feels like reliving the betrayal all over again. And when leaders refuse to release the full record, it sends a brutal message: protecting reputations matters more than protecting people. Raskin's question, who is being protected, cuts to this painful truth. If the answer isn't the survivors, then the cost is measured in real lives, in families broken, and in trust shattered. For survivors, justice delayed doesn't just mean justice denied, it means justice erased. Jamie Raskin's challenge was more than a speech, it was a line drawn in the sand. By asking who is being protected, he forced Congress, and the country, to confront what's really at stake. This debate isn't just about releasing documents, it's about whether the justice system serves the powerful or the powerless, whether survivors are believed or abandoned, and whether transparency is a principle or a bargaining chip. Every delay, every excuse, answers the question in real time. Because if the survivors aren't the ones being protected, then it's clear who is, and that truth should disturb every American. Survivors have shown unimaginable courage by speaking out, often at great personal cost. The least the public can do is echo their voices and refuse to let this story fade. The files are more than evidence, they are a chance to end decades of silence and finally shine light on the networks of exploitation that thrived in the shadows. If those in power won't demand accountability, then it falls on us to keep asking the question Raskin put on the record. Because until those files are released, justice will remain a promise unfulfilled.